Inside California's Pelican Bay Supermax, a true crime prison exposé. The sound of fists slamming against steel echoed through the long, cold hallway of Pelican Bay. In the security housing unit, known to inmates as the SHU, guards rushed to a cell where two prisoners were locked in a brutal fight. One man had sharpened a piece of metal into a homemade weapon. Another, his target, was cornered against the wall, blood already streaking down his chest. The alarm blared, red lights flashed, and the entire block shook with chaos. Guards shouted orders, but the inmates didn't stop. They fought as if their lives depended on it. At Pelican Bay, maybe they did. What happened next would leave the prison staff questioning how such violence could erupt inside one of the most secure prisons in the United States. Pelican Bay State Prison, built on the remote northern edge of California near the Oregon border, was designed to cage the most dangerous men in the country. It opened in 1989 with one mission: to isolate gang leaders and violent criminals who had turned other prisons into war zones. Its SHU, a place of windowless concrete cells, was built to break communication and cut off power structures. But even here, where inmates were locked alone for 22 to 23 hours a day, crime and violence still found a way. Daily life in the SHU was cold and repetitive. Prisoners ate alone. They showered alone. Their only break from the four walls was a small, concrete yard known as the dog run, a bare pen with no view of the outside world. But beneath this silence, power struggles brewed. Prison gangs like the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and Nuestra Familia used coded notes, smuggled messages, and even body language to pass orders. Violence could erupt without warning, and when it did, it was swift and merciless. The fight that began in that cell spread down the tier like a wildfire. Inmates banged on doors, shouting encouragement or threats. Guards in riot gear stormed the block, shields up, batons ready. One officer fired a warning round from a block gun, sending a loud boom through the unit. The smell of pepper spray filled the air. The two fighters were dragged out, coughing, bloodied, their homemade weapon clattering on the floor. But just when the block seemed under control, a new sound pierced the chaos. A second alarm, this time from the yard outside. Another violent attack had begun. The second alarm echoed through the concrete corridors of Pelican Bay like a war drum. Guards who had barely caught their breath from the first fight now sprinted toward the yard. The SHU yard was supposed to be secure. It was just a bare, concrete pen with 20-foot-high walls and a steel grate covering the top like a cage. There was no grass, no trees, no horizon, just gray cement and the sound of footsteps echoing. Inmates called it the dog run, because it felt more like a kennel than a yard. They were let out alone or in small groups for an hour at a time. But even in this barren space, violence had found its way. When the officers reached the yard, they saw two men locked in combat. Both were tattooed head to toe, their bodies covered in ink that told their life stories, gang symbols, prison ranks, and reminders of murders committed long before. One man had a piece of sharpened plastic, likely taken from a food tray or smuggled out of the kitchen. The other had nothing but his fists, yet he fought with the desperation of someone who knew losing meant death. Blood was already spattered across the cement floor, and the air was filled with curses and the sound of bodies slamming against the walls. Guards shouted orders through megaphones, "Get down! On the ground! Now!" But the men ignored them. In Pelican Bay, fear of rival gangs often outweighed fear of the guards. Losing face meant losing respect, and respect meant survival. Inmates lived by a brutal code: once you start, you don't back down. The fight went on, savage and raw, until a guard fired another block gun. The beanbag round hit one of the men in the chest, knocking him flat. Pepper spray rained down in thick orange clouds, burning skin and choking lungs. Within seconds, both men were pinned, handcuffed, and dragged out of the yard. But the violence had already done its damage. The entire unit was on edge. Guards tightened security, checking cells for hidden weapons, while inmates banged on their doors, shouting and taunting. It was chaos layered over silence. A place built to bury men alive but somehow still alive with violence. To understand why fights like this erupted, you have to look deeper into how Pelican Bay was designed and why it became the center of America's war against prison gangs. Unlike regular prisons, where inmates lived in dorms or shared cells, the SHU at Pelican Bay was built for complete isolation. Each cell was an 8 by 10-foot concrete box with a heavy steel door and no windows. The only light came from a fluorescent bulb overhead. Meals were delivered through a slot in the door. For 1 hour a day, inmates were let into the dog run, where they could see only sky through the mesh above. This setup was supposed to cut off the communication lines that gangs relied on. The idea was simple: If leaders couldn't talk to their soldiers, they couldn't give orders, and without orders, the violence would stop. But reality was different. Inmates became experts at sending messages. They used tiny notes called kites, passed through cracks or flushed through the plumbing system to other cells. They hid codes inside legal documents. They tapped on pipes and patterns. Some even used their body language during yard time, gestures, hand signs, or even blinking, to send signals. Pelican Bay became less a place of silence and more a place of whispers, hidden under layers of concrete. The 2 fights in one day were not random. They were signals, signs that gang politics were shifting inside. The Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Aryan Brotherhood all had strongholds here, and every act of violence carried a message. Sometimes it was revenge for a slight. Sometimes it was a test of loyalty. Other times it was part of a bigger plan, a move in a chess game that stretched across multiple prisons in California. For the guards, every day felt like walking into a storm they couldn't predict. They never knew if the cell doors would stay silent or if blood would flow before lunch. Some officers described the SHU as the most tense place they had ever worked. The quiet could turn deadly in seconds, and the echo of violence stayed with them long after their shifts ended. That day, after the second fight was controlled, the prison locked down. Every inmate was confined to his cell. Meals were slid through slots without a word. Medical staff moved quickly, stitching wounds and checking broken bones. Reports were written, cameras reviewed, weapons collected. But the sense of unease didn't fade. The guards knew what the inmates knew. Violence never came alone at Pelican Bay. If 2 fights erupted in one day, more were likely coming. As night fell, the SHU was cloaked in silence again. Inmates lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, plotting their next move. The guards patrolled the tiers, boots echoing against steel, watching for any sign of trouble. But behind those thick concrete walls, a new plan was already in motion. Someone had smuggled in something far more dangerous than a sharpened piece of plastic. Something that would turn the entire prison upside down. The whispers began the next morning. Guards walking the tier could feel the tension in the air. It was thicker than the pepper spray still lingering in some corners. The fights yesterday had left their mark, but something else was brewing. Pelican Bay was a place where silence itself could feel violent, and today silence was everywhere. When officers slid breakfast trays through the slots, most inmates didn't even speak. They just stared back with cold eyes, waiting. For correctional officers, that was the worst sign. Loud banging on the doors, shouting insults, that was normal. But silence meant planning. Silence meant gangs were aligning their moves. And silence often meant blood. Unbeknownst to the guards, a weapon had made its way into the SHU, something far more lethal than the sharpened plastics they had confiscated the day before. It wasn't just a shank carved from metal or a hidden razor. This was a piece of smuggled steel, forged into a blade sharp enough to pierce through flesh and even stab past protective gear. In a place built to crush communication, inmates had managed to coordinate a smuggling operation that reached from outside the walls to the heart of Pelican Bay. The story of how it got there is still whispered in prison circles today. Some said it was hidden in a package of legal mail. Others swore it came in with a corrupt staff member, an officer bought off with promises of cash, protection, or favors. No one ever proved it, but one fact was certain. The blade was real and it was waiting to be used. Life in the SHU carried on like routine. Guards checked doors, made their rounds, and logged their reports. But for the inmates, the day felt different. In one corner cell, a leader of the Mexican Mafia sat with his back against the wall, his tattoos like a map of violence. He had been in solitary for years, locked away with nothing but his thoughts. But even from a concrete box he could send orders. Through kites, codes, and trusted soldiers he had set today in motion. The blade wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. By afternoon, tension boiled over. 2 guards escorted a prisoner down the hallway in shackles. He walked slowly, his chains rattling with every step. His eyes, however, weren't on the ground, they were locked on a rival gang member being moved in the opposite direction. For a split second, both men passed each other in the corridor, separated only by a few feet and the guards standing between them. Words were exchanged, short and sharp like sparks off a wire. The guards didn't catch them, but every inmate within earshot understood what was said. It was a promise of blood. That night, Pelican Bay was locked tight again. Lights dimmed, doors sealed, and silence swallowed the SHU. But in one cell, an inmate crouched low on his concrete floor, pressing a sharpened steel blade against the ground, testing its edge. The plan was simple but deadly. During the next yard time rotation, when inmates from rival gangs crossed paths, he would strike. It didn't matter that cameras were watching, or that guards were armed with block guns and pepper spray. This wasn't about survival. It was about control. Morning arrived, and with it came the sound of doors buzzing open. Yard time began. Inmates shuffled into the dog runs one by one, each watched closely by correctional officers. Some stretched, some paced, some simply stood still, staring at the sky. But one man had a mission. The yard pen clanged shut, locking him inside with a rival. For a moment, both men circled each other in silence, their eyes cold, their tattoos marking who they belonged to. Then, without warning, the blade flashed. The inmate lunged, steel in his hand, slashing forward with brutal speed. The rival went down screaming, blood pooling quickly on the concrete. Guards erupted into action. Shouts, alarms, boots pounding the ground. Pepper spray burst into the air, choking everyone inside the pen. A block gun thundered, sending beanbag rounds slamming into the attacker's chest. But even as he fell to the ground, his mission was complete. The blade had drawn blood, and the message was clear. The gangs of Pelican Bay were alive and powerful, no matter how many walls the state built around them. The victim was dragged out on a stretcher, his body shaking from blood loss. The attacker was yanked into chains, coughing and spitting through clouds of pepper spray. Guards sealed the yard and locked the unit down, hearts racing from adrenaline and fear. For the rest of the prison, the incident was more than just another fight. It was proof that the system meant to silence gang leaders was failing. The SHU hadn't broken their spirit. If anything, it had sharpened their will. Violence wasn't going away, it was escalating. And everyone inside Pelican Bay knew it. As the night settled in again, officers patrolled the tier, their hands gripping batons tighter than usual. Inmates whispered through vents and pipes, passing along the story of the stabbing like a legend in the making. But while the guards struggled to contain the chaos, another secret was already slipping into the prison, hidden in the shadows. What they didn't know was that the stabbing was just the beginning of something far worse. The yard stabbing sent shockwaves through Pelican Bay. By morning, the entire prison was on lockdown. No movement. No programs. No visits. Just steel doors and silence. Guards patrolled the tiers in pairs now, their hands resting on pepper spray canisters and block guns, eyes darting to every shadow. Inmates were stripped, searched, and questioned. Cells were torn apart in frantic searches for more contraband. Mattresses were ripped open, vents checked, even toilets flushed in hopes of finding another weapon. But the blade was already gone, hidden or smuggled out by the same network that had brought it in. For inmates, lockdowns were nothing new. They knew how to wait, how to bide their time. In fact, some thrived on it. Locked in 23 hours a day, they used the silence as cover for their own strategies. One gang member tapped out a coded message on the plumbing system, sending it through the pipes to a cell 3 doors down. Another used scraps of paper to write a kite so small it could be hidden in a seam of his clothing. Orders were moving across the SHU like invisible currents in the ocean, silent, powerful, unstoppable. But the stabbing had done more than wound one man. It had triggered a chain reaction. Rival gangs smelled weakness, and each one wanted to prove their dominance. The Mexican Mafia wanted to show they still controlled the prison yards. Nuestra Familia wanted revenge for the blood spilled. The Aryan Brotherhood, watching from the shadows, saw opportunity in the chaos. Violence wasn't just a possibility now. It was inevitable. Days stretched into a week of lockdown. Guards believed they had regained control. Reports were filed, cameras reviewed, and medical staff treated the wounded inmate. The administration assured Sacramento that Pelican Bay was secure again. But underneath, the gangs were building toward something bigger. Something no lockdown could prevent. It began with a meal tray. One afternoon, when officers slid food through the slots, an inmate pushed his tray back out. He refused to eat. Within hours, others followed. Tray after tray came sliding back through the slots, untouched. A hunger strike had begun. At first, the guards thought it was nothing but a protest. Inmates had gone on strikes before, refusing food to demand more privileges or to protest conditions. But this time was different. This strike wasn't about television, exercise, or commissary. This was about control of the SHU itself. The gangs were making a statement. They would not be broken. The strike spread fast. Within days, hundreds of inmates in solitary were refusing meals. Trays stacked up in hallways. Food rotted, uneaten. Medical staff walked from cell to cell, checking vitals, warning inmates about dehydration and organ failure. Some men lay on their bunks, eyes sunken, refusing even to look at the guards. Others shouted through the doors, telling officers that Pelican Bay would burn before they surrendered their power. The administration scrambled. Hunger strikes were dangerous, not just for inmates but for the prison itself. Media outlets began calling. Lawyers demanded answers. Families gathered outside the gates, holding signs. Pelican Bay wasn't supposed to be visible to the outside world, but suddenly, it was on the evening news. Inside, the strike turned the SHU into a battlefield of willpower. Some inmates fainted in their cells, too weak to stand. Others grew violent, lashing out at guards who tried to check their vitals. The air was filled with tension and the stench of uneaten food. Guards, already stretched thin, now had to decide: force-feed the men through tubes or risk deaths that could spark riots across the entire state prison system. But then, amid the strike, came another spark of violence. During a rare shower rotation, an inmate managed to slip past a distracted officer. It lasted only seconds, but that was enough. He lunged at another prisoner, fists flying, his weakened body fueled by rage instead of food. Guards rushed in, wrestling him to the ground, but not before the rival was left bloodied on the concrete floor, gasping for air. That single outburst was all it took. Word spread instantly: the hunger strike was not just protest, it was war. A coordinated move to destabilize Pelican Bay from the inside. And it was working. Guards couldn't keep order. Administrators couldn't calm the press. Families were demanding answers. And the gangs had just proven that even without food, even without strength, they could still strike. As the lockdown dragged into another week, officers grew restless. Sleep was short. Stress was high. Every meal shift was a gamble. Would the trays come back, or would someone try to stab a guard through the slot? Every patrol felt heavier, as if the silence itself were pressing down on them. Some officers whispered about transfers. Others clenched their jaws and swore they'd never let the inmates win. But deep down, many knew the truth: the balance of power was shifting, and not in their favor. By the 10th day of the strike, several inmates had been rushed to medical units, their bodies shutting down. But as they were wheeled past, weak and pale, their eyes still burned with defiance. To them, suffering wasn't defeat. It was proof of loyalty, proof of power. And for every inmate lying in a hospital bed, 10 more stayed strong in their cells, waiting for the next chance to strike. That chance came one night when the power flickered. For only a few minutes, the lights in one wing of the SHU went dark. Emergency backup systems kicked in, bathing the block in dim red light. But in those few minutes of near darkness, chaos erupted. A guard making his rounds heard a metallic clang, something hitting the floor. He turned, shining his flashlight, just in time to see an arm reach out from a food slot. In the hand was another weapon, glinting in the red light. The inmate thrust it forward, narrowly missing the guard's leg. Alarm screamed. Officers swarmed the tier. Pepper spray filled the air again, and the attacker was dragged out, coughing and bleeding from beanbag rounds. The blade? Gone again. Hidden, passed, or destroyed before it could be collected. And the message was clear. Even locked in the most secure prison in America in near total isolation, the gang still had power. The lights flickered back on. The block returned to its eerie silence. But everyone inside, guards and inmates alike, knew the truth. Pelican Bay wasn't under control. It was a time bomb, and the clock was ticking. The Blackout attack changed everything. Guards who once carried themselves with authority now walked the tier with suspicion in their eyes. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning. The message had been sent loud and clear. Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't a tomb, it was a battlefield. And the men inside weren't broken. They were waiting. Administration scrambled to regain control. Wardens' meetings stretched late into the night. Outside, pressure mounted from Sacramento, where lawmakers demanded answers on how violence was still erupting inside California's most expensive Supermax. Lock them down harder, one politician barked. Cut off everything, no mail, no yard, nothing. But the problem was the SHU was already built on nothing. It was isolation at its purest. Taking more away wouldn't stop the gangs. It would only fuel their anger. Inside, the tension spread like fire. Guards doubled their checks, slamming food slots shut so hard they echoed through the block. Inmates retaliated with defiance. They clogged toilets, flooded cells, and shouted insults through the vents. At night, the silence was broken by sudden banging, fists hammering steel doors in unison like drums of war. The sound traveled down the tier in waves, boom, 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 until the entire block shook with rage. For the inmates, the Blackout blade had been a victory. Not because a guard was hurt, but because they had proven they could still create fear. Fear was a weapon sharper than any shank. And now, the gangs had their sights set on something even bigger: regaining control of the prison yard, the one place where violence could spread like wildfire in front of dozens of witnesses. But before that day would come, the prison simmered through smaller battles. A young inmate, new to the SHU, refused to follow orders. He was told to cuff up through the slot for a routine search. Instead, he stood still, glaring at the officer, his hands clenched. The standoff lasted for minutes before a team in riot gear was called in. They stormed the cell with shields and pepper spray, dragging him out while he kicked and screamed. Blood smeared the floor, and the young man was left bruised and shackled. To the guards, it was just another day. To the inmates, it was another story of resistance. Days blurred into nights, and the air in Pelican Bay thickened with unease. Guards whispered about leaving the SHU detail, hoping for transfer to less volatile prisons. Some hardened officers laughed it off, saying the gangs were bluffing, that the isolation had made them desperate. But those who had seen the hunger strike, the stabbing, and the Blackout attack knew better. The gangs weren't desperate. They were patient. Then came the rumor. A whisper passed through the pipes, through the food slots, through coded words and legal mail. Something was coming. Something bigger than a stabbing, bigger than a hunger strike. It was vague, just a phrase: the yard will burn. Guards overheard fragments of conversations, but they couldn't piece it together. Still, the unease grew. The SHU was a place of anticipation now, where both sides knew something was coming but no one knew when. On the morning it began, the sun barely broke through the coastal fog that always seemed to wrap Pelican Bay in gray. Yard rotation started like any other. Inmates were cuffed, escorted, and locked into the dog runs. Guards stood on watch, scanning every movement. Most inmates walked in slow circles, stretching their arms, breathing the cold air. But one group of men stood still, backs against the wall, their eyes fixed on another pen across the yard. It happened in a flash. One inmate pulled a hidden shank from his waistband, a weapon no search had found. He lunged forward, stabbing the air through the mesh fence at a rival just feet away. Almost instantly, others joined in, men pressing against the fences, shouting, stabbing, swinging fists through the steel mesh. It was chaos contained in cages, but chaos nonetheless. Guards scrambled. Alarms blared again. Pepper spray rained down like fire, filling the cages with choking clouds. Block guns thundered, each blast shaking the yard. But the violence didn't stop. Inmates, coughing and blinded, still swung wildly, blood streaking across the concrete as shanks pierced through gaps in the fences. It wasn't about killing this time, it was about showing force, showing that even under cages, even under constant watch, the gangs could turn the yard into a war zone. By the time the riot squad stormed in, shields raised, the yard was soaked with blood. Several inmates lay on the ground, their bodies marked with stab wounds. Others pressed against the walls, their eyes filled with hate, their tattoos standing out like war paint under the harsh prison lights. Guards dragged bodies out one by one, some conscious, some not. The yard looked less like a place of exercise and more like a battlefield after a skirmish. That night, the prison locked down again. Reports flooded in, how the shanks had been hidden, how the attack had been coordinated, how the guards had been outnumbered even though every man was in a cage. Sacramento demanded more answers. Families outside the walls protested louder. And inside, the inmates whispered with pride. The yard had burned just as promised. But what no one realized yet, neither the guards nor the administration, nor even the public, was that this riot wasn't the climax. It was the warning shot. Something darker was brewing inside Pelican Bay, and the gangs had only just begun to show their hand. The SHU fell silent again after the riot. But in the silence, everyone knew, the next explosion would be worse. The yard riot was still fresh in everyone's mind when dawn broke the next day. The halls of Pelican Bay smelled faintly of bleach and blood. Guards moved slower, their boots dragging across the concrete as if the weight of the prison itself had settled on their shoulders. They had contained the riot, yes, but the victory felt hollow. The gangs had won something bigger than the fight. They had proven they could ignite chaos at will, even inside cages designed to stop them. The warden stood in the control room staring at screens replaying the riot footage. Every second of stabbing and shouting had been recorded. He rewound it again and again, looking for the mistake, where the weapons had come from, how the communication had slipped through. The truth gnawed at him. It wasn't one mistake. It was the system. Pelican Bay had been designed to bury men in silence, but instead, it had created pressure cookers of rage. The administration's solution was predictable. More lockdowns, more searches, more force. Cells were torn apart for the third time in a week. Inmates were stripped, their belongings confiscated, and every scrap of paper examined for hidden codes. Mail was delayed or destroyed. But each time guards finished a search, inmates smirked from their bunks as if to say, "You'll never stop us." Life in the SHU became even more brutal. Meals were smaller. Yard time was reduced to minutes. Medical checks were cut short. Inmates tapped on the walls less now, speaking less, but the silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like plotting. The guards could sense it. Even when the cell block was quiet, their stomachs twisted with unease. For weeks, tension simmered without a single outbreak of violence. The quiet was unnatural. Guards told each other it was over, that the riot had broken the gangs. But the veterans knew better. In Pelican Bay, violence didn't disappear. It waited. Then came the note. A rookie officer just weeks on the job found it during a routine tear check. A tiny kite, rolled paper no larger than a matchstick, slipped through the food slot of an inmate's cell. The officer unfolded it with trembling fingers. The words were written in jagged pencil, but the message was clear: blood for blood. Soon. The kite was rushed to the captain's office. Guards doubled their patrols again. Riot teams were put on standby. But despite all the extra eyes and ears, no one could see where the next strike would come from. The answer arrived one cold morning during showers. Inmates in the SHU were taken out one at a time, escorted by 2 guards, cuffed at the wrists and ankles. The showers were small, concrete stalls with a steel door and only a slit for the guards to watch through. It was routine. But routine is where Pelican Bay was most dangerous. One inmate, a nuestra familia soldier, had been hiding something for days. The weapon wasn't steel this time. It was sharper, quieter, and easier to conceal. A shard of glass, broken from a piece of mirror in his cell and wrapped in cloth. During his shower rotation, he pressed the shard against the wall, hiding it until the guards unlocked his cuffs. The moment his wrists were free, he struck. With lightning speed, he slashed at the nearest officer, cutting deep across the man's arm. Blood sprayed against the concrete wall. The second guard shouted, fumbling for his pepper spray, but the inmate lunged again, cutting at his face. Chaos exploded in the tiny stall. The wounded officer stumbled back, clutching his arm, screaming. The second officer fired pepper spray, choking the room with orange mist. The inmate coughed, eyes burning, but he kept swinging, desperate, relentless. Reinforcements stormed the hall. Shields slammed against steel. A block gun thundered. The inmate dropped, beanbag rounds pounding into his ribs, but not before both officers were bleeding on the floor. The prison roared to life. Alarms blared. Boots thundered down the hall. Radios crackled with urgent voices. Man down! Man down in showers. Within minutes, the block was a battlefield. Guards dragged their wounded out while the attacker, bloodied and bruised, was shackled and hauled to medical under heavy guard. His eyes burned with defiance even as his body sagged with exhaustion. News of the attack spread faster than fire. Inmates banged on their doors, shouting through vents, "We're still here. We're still strong." The sound carried through the SHU, echoing off concrete walls like a war chant. Guards tightened their grips on batons, some shaking with adrenaline, others with fear. For the staff, this was the breaking point. The yard riot had shown that gangs could fight even in cages. The Blackout attack had shown they could reach guards. But the shower stabbing proved something worse, that no routine was safe. Every step, every escort, every meal delivery could turn lethal in a heartbeat. The administration tried to spin it. Press releases said the situation was contained. Sacramento was told the officers would survive. But inside the prison, the truth was undeniable. Pelican Bay wasn't a place of control. It was a powder keg. Every lockdown, every restriction, every punishment only fed the fire. That night, as the block settled into uneasy silence, the wounded guards were stitched up in the infirmary. The inmate who carried out the attack sat chained in an isolation cell, blood dried on his hands, a faint smile on his face. And in the cells around him, hundreds of eyes stared into the dark, waiting for the next opportunity. Because in Pelican Bay, violence never ended. It only evolved. And as long as the gangs drew breath inside those walls, the blood would keep flowing. The next explosion was already on its way. The shower stabbing left the prison in shock. For the staff, it was a wake-up call that no amount of locks, steel doors, or isolation could fully contain the violence simmering inside Pelican Bay. For the inmates, it was proof of their power, a reminder that even when stripped of freedom, stripped of contact, stripped of nearly every human right, they could still strike fear into the heart of the system. The administration responded with the harshest lockdown in years. For weeks, not a single inmate left his cell. Food was shoved through slots. Lights stayed on day and night. Yard time vanished entirely. Even medical checks were reduced to quick glances through the door. Guards patrolled in silence, moving like ghosts through the gray hallways. It was as if the prison had swallowed itself, turning inward in a desperate attempt to keep from collapsing. But silence at Pelican Bay was never safe. It was the pause before the storm. And this storm would be the most violent of all. The gangs, weakened by hunger strikes and constant lockdowns, were desperate to prove they still ruled the SHU. Leaders whispered orders through vents and pipes, their voices carrying across concrete like invisible currents. A plan began to form, not just another stabbing or shower ambush. This would be something larger. A coordinated uprising inside the most secure unit in California. It started with a diversion. One evening, as dinner trays were being passed, an inmate shoved his arm through the food slot and refused to pull it back. The guard tugged, shouting orders, but the inmate held fast. Within seconds, others followed. Hands shot out of food slots across the tier, fists pounding, trays flying. The sound was deafening, metal against metal, shouts echoing, the block alive with fury. Then came the real strike. In one cell, an inmate who had hidden a sharpened piece of steel sprang into action. He jammed the weapon through the food slot, slashing at the leg of an officer who was trying to contain the chaos. Another inmate, farther down the tier, hurled a burning wad of paper out of his slot, igniting a small fire in the hallway. Smoke filled the air. Guards scrambled, radios crackling, alarms wailing. The SHU, built to be unbreakable, was unraveling in real time. The riot squad stormed the block, shields raised, beanbag rounds slamming against steel. Pepper spray filled the corridor, burning eyes and lungs until visibility dropped to nothing. Inmates coughed and screamed but refused to back down, shouting gang slogans, chanting threats. It wasn't just about the guards anymore. It was about sending a message to every prison in California. The gangs of Pelican Bay still lived, still fought, still ruled. The battle raged for nearly an hour. Fires were stamped out. Weapons were confiscated. Inmates were dragged out, coughing and bleeding, their bodies bruised by beanbag rounds. Guards staggered away, eyes streaming from the pepper spray, uniforms streaked with blood and sweat. The block was left in ruins, smoke still curling from blackened spots on the floor. When the chaos finally ended, the SHU was silent again. But it was a silence different from before, heavy, exhausted, like the air after a storm. Guards slumped against walls, catching their breath. Inmates lay in their cells, battered but unbroken, their eyes burning through the steel doors. The aftermath was brutal. Dozens of inmates were hospitalized. Several guards carried scars that would never heal. Sacramento launched investigations. The media swarmed, headlines screaming about the riot inside California's toughest prison. Families of staff demanded accountability, while advocates for inmates pointed to the inhumanity of isolation as the fuel for the violence. Everyone had an opinion. No one had an answer. And Pelican Bay remained what it had always been, a paradox. Built to silence, yet filled with noise. Built to isolate, yet alive with connection. Built to crush gangs, yet forever shaped by their power. In the years that followed, lawsuits were filed, policies challenged, reforms demanded. The hunger strikes of Pelican Bay reached the courts, sparking debates about solitary confinement and human rights. Some changes came, limits on how long men could be held in isolation, more oversight on the SHU. But the legacy of Pelican Bay was already written in blood and concrete. Today, Pelican Bay stands as both fortress and warning. A fortress against the most violent men California has ever caged. A warning about what happens when isolation becomes the answer to everything. The gangs may have been weakened, their networks disrupted, but the echoes of their power still linger in every hallway, every cell, every memory of those who lived and worked there. For the guards, it remains a place of scars, physical and mental, that they carry long after they leave. For the inmates, it remains a crucible of survival, where respect was life, silence was language, and violence was inevitable. And for the outside world, Pelican Bay remains a hidden story, one that few ever see but all should know. A story not of redemption or peace, but of what happens when human beings are pushed to their limits and locked away in the darkest corners of the justice system. Inside California's Pelican Bay Supermax, every day was a war. A war of gangs against gangs. A war of inmates against guards. A war of the prison itself against the human spirit. And though the battles may have ended, the war left marks that will never fade. Because Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a true crime exposé in real time, a place where the system tried to bury violence only to find it growing stronger in the dark.